Welcome to Headline Wednesday from Dispatch, U.S. Military History Magazine, developed by Trackpads.com. Today, we go to Lorraine in the Second World War for the story of the Foggy Tank Battle at Arracourt. Dawn over the rolling farmland near Arracourt does not really break so much as seep in. It is September 1944 in eastern France, and a heavy fog lies over the low fields and hedgerows, turning every rise and orchard into a gray wall. Inside a Sherman tank from the United States 4th Armored Division, the crew can barely see the hedgerow 30 yards away. The commander peers through his periscope and sees nothing but white. Somewhere out in that blank curtain, German engines are idling, their sound muffled like distant thunder wrapped in cotton. The landscape feels close and claustrophobic. Along the thin American line, tank destroyer crews and armored infantrymen strain to separate real movement from tricks of the light. A half-seen shape could be a haystack, a tree, or a German Panther inching forward. Radios crackle with half-formed reports as outposts call in brief glimpses that fade as quickly as they appear. Men talk about contacts lost in the mist, flashes of turrets, and the clank of tracks crossing hidden ditches. The Americans know they are deep into Lorraine, well ahead of much of the supply chain, and they are used to pushing forward rather than waiting to be hit. This morning feels different. It feels like the enemy is hunting. When the first muzzle flashes stab through the haze, they do so at ranges that would look ridiculous on a gunnery table. Shermans fire almost by instinct, aiming at sound and fleeting silhouettes rather than clear outlines. On the other side, German gunners try to pick out targets through the same wall of gray, guessing at where the enemy will appear. Some shells hit nothing but earth and hedgerow, throwing up showers of dirt and leaves. Others strike with sudden violence, turning a tank or half-track into a brief orange lantern in the fog. The battlefield flickers. Men on both sides are fighting half-blind, and they know it. Crews fall back on drilled routines, fast reactions, and the thin threads of information passed over their radio nets. Tank commanders trade hurried range calls and bearings, trying to build a mental map of a fight they can barely see. In the fields around Arracourt, the tankers do not yet know that these murky morning clashes are only the beginning. Over the coming days, this fog-bound struggle will grow into a battle that wrecks one of Germany's last real Panzer hopes in the West. The cost will be high. To understand why this quiet patch of farmland matters so much, you have to pull the camera back to the late summer of 1944. After the German front cracked in Normandy, American armored divisions surged into the open country of France, where speed and initiative started to matter as much as armor thickness. The 4th Armored Division built a reputation as a fast, flexible spearhead, racing across rivers and through towns in a campaign that felt, for a time, like relentless forward motion. That pace came at a cost in worn engines and tired crews. Fuel stocks thinned, maintenance piled up, and the tankers, who had been fighting almost non-stop, now found themselves holding forward ground while supply echelons struggled to keep up. In Lorraine, Patton's Third Army drove toward the crossings of the Moselle River and the gateway to the German border. On a wall map, the advance looked smooth and unstoppable, a broad arrow pushing east. On the ground around Arracourt, the reality was a thin armored screen spread over difficult country. Rolling fields, orchards, and low ridges broke up lines of sight, and in bad weather they could hide entire formations. The forward units were stretched and tired, supported by logistics that were working at the edge of what the roads and depots could carry. It was a powerful force, but also a vulnerable one. One hard blow could matter. Across the line, German leaders understood that they could not simply watch the enemy roll up to their frontier. They scraped together new Panzer brigades, mixing refurbished tanks with inexperienced crews and remnants pulled from shattered formations. The idea was simple and desperate at the same time. They would strike hard into Lorraine, catch Patton's spearheads off balance, and smash the American armor that had outrun much of its support. If they could cut into the 4th Armored Division and its neighbors, they might stall the advance and buy time to rebuild defenses on German soil. They also hoped to restore some badly needed belief among their own soldiers. That is what makes Arracourt more than a local clash of tanks on a foggy morning. The small villages and ridgelines in this quiet corner of France sit on the flank of the American drive east. If the German counterattack succeeds here, it can roll up the line from the side, isolate forward units, and force the Third Army to pause or even fall back. Fuel, ammunition, and replacements are already moving at the limits of what the supply system can sustain, and a disruption along the armored screen could ripple all the way up the chain of command. The stakes reach far beyond a few square miles of farmland. For the tank crews waiting in the mist, the calculation is brutally simple, even if they do not see the full map. They must hold this ground against a fresh Panzer force that believes it has found a soft flank. If they fail, the momentum of the campaign in France could bleed away here in the gray light around Arracourt. If they succeed, they will keep open the road toward the Moselle and the German border. In the fog, with engines rumbling and radios hissing, they prepare to meet that test at point-blank range. Engines rumble in the fog around Arracourt, but the story of how those tanks came to face each other began weeks earlier on the hedgerow lanes of Normandy. Once the German front cracked there, American armored divisions burst into the open country of France, where speed and initiative suddenly mattered as much as armor thickness. The 4th Armored Division in particular built a reputation as a fast, flexible spearhead, racing across rivers and through towns in a campaign that felt, at least for a time, like relentless forward motion. That sense of constant movement was real. It was also expensive. Every mile of that advance came with a cost in worn engines and tired crews. Fuel stocks thinned as columns pushed far from their depots, and fuel trucks struggled to keep pace along battered roads. Maintenance demands piled up on tanks and half-tracks that rarely stayed still long enough for a thorough overhaul. Crews who had been fighting almost non-stop now found themselves holding forward ground with machines that needed rest and repair. Supply echelons fought their own battle against distance and traffic jams. The armored spearhead looked sharp, but it was not invulnerable. Lorraine, the region into which they drove, was never simple country for armor. Around Arracourt, the land formed a patchwork of rolling fields, orchards, small woods, and low ridges stitched together by villages and narrow roads. In clear weather, a tank commander could use those folds and tree lines to mask movement, set up hull-down positions, and choose where to fight. In autumn, with mist pooling in the low ground, these same features turned into hiding places and blind corners. The terrain could be either a shield or a trap. American crews from the 4th Armored Division and attached tank destroyer battalions had to learn that ground the hard way. They patrolled by day, feeling out every lane and ridge that might matter in a fight. At night, they listened to the countryside to pick up clues about German movements and local patterns. Tank commanders and scouts built mental maps of each rise, hedgerow, and orchard that could conceal a gun or an approaching column. That local knowledge would matter more than they yet understood. It would become a quiet advantage. Across the line, German commanders were facing their own crisis. The formations shattered in Normandy had left deep gaps in their armored strength in the west, gaps that could not be filled by simply renaming battered units. To answer Patton's advance into Lorraine, Berlin pushed out new Panzer brigades built around modern tanks but staffed by a mix of hardened veterans and barely trained replacements. Their orders pressed them to attack quickly into Lorraine before the Americans could consolidate their gains or fix their supply troubles. They felt the pressure of time. Those brigades rolled east to west, expecting to find scattered American columns, overconfident crews, and a chance to cut into the flank of Third Army. The planners imagined striking thin screens, breaking through, and rolling up rear areas that were poorly guarded. On their maps, the operation looked like a bold counterstroke that might stop the American drive on the threshold of Germany. In the real fields around Arracourt, they ran instead into battle-hardened tankers who had been learning, day by day, how to use this particular country and its weather to their advantage. The Germans were about to discover how costly that mismatch could be. When the German counterattack finally came in strength, it did not arrive as a neat textbook assault. It came as armored columns feeling their way through heavy fog, guided by sketchy maps and hurried briefings given the night before. Tanks and self-propelled guns moved along country roads and across fields, while scouts peered ahead into what was, to them, a solid wall of gray. The plan on paper was to drive straight into the American positions around Arracourt, punch through the thin armored screen, and roll up supply and command points in the rear. In the murk, the plan began to fray almost at once. Formations drifted as drivers lost visual contact with the vehicles ahead and tried to navigate by dead reckoning rather than landmarks they could not see. Units lost contact with sister elements that had started on parallel routes. Whole companies blundered off axis, emerging in places they did not expect, and at times that no longer matched the schedule. What was meant to be a coordinated blow with multiple brigades striking in step began to splinter into a series of separated thrusts. Each thrust was dangerous, but none had the full weight originally intended. The fog cut both ways. In that kind of close, fog-bound fight, the long-range gun on a Panther meant less than who saw whom first and who could get off an accurate round before disappearing again. Radio nets in the 4th Armored Division crackled as platoons and companies called out bearings, rough ranges, and reports of burning vehicles. Those reports, stitched together in real time, created a rough picture of where the Panzer thrusts were actually landing. German units, with weaker communications and more confusion, struggled to match that picture. Their gunners often fired at ghosts, while the Americans focused on solid, shared targets. The fighting around the small villages and crossroads of the Arracourt sector turned into a series of brutal, confused engagements. A German platoon might crest what looked like a gentle rise, expecting to see open country ahead, only to meet American guns at a few hundred yards. An American tank destroyer section might set up along a hedgerow, knock out the lead vehicle in a German column, and then sprint to a new position before the enemy could bring aimed fire to bear. Infantry on both sides hugged the ground, diving for ditches and cellars as tanks traded shots over their heads. It was close and chaotic. From time to time, the fog thinned or lifted just enough for crews to glimpse the wider field. When that happened, they saw burning wrecks scattered across slopes and in orchards. Tanks halted at odd angles that told stories of surprise and hurried maneuvers. They saw smoke pillars marking sudden kills. Then the mist would close again like a curtain, cutting those views off and forcing everyone back into the world of sound, instinct, and brief flashes of light. The battle felt like a series of scenes, each one hidden from the next. As the hours and days went on, a pattern emerged, even if no single crew could see all of it. German armored groups probed forward, lost cohesion in the fog and the folds of the terrain, and then ran into small, coordinated American defenses that hit hard and shifted ground before a full response could form. The newcomers, in their heavy tanks, held the advantage on paper with thick armor and powerful guns. They were still attacking blind into an enemy that knew the ground and talked freely over reliable radios. That mismatch grew more costly with every clash. At headquarters behind the lines, German officers tried to piece together reports that did not quite match. They weighed claims of enemy tanks destroyed against their own mounting losses and the steady drumbeat of requests for replacement vehicles. Maps filled with arrows that no longer tracked cleanly with reality. Out in the mist near Arracourt, tank crews on both sides could sense that something larger was happening than a simple clash of patrols or a single failed thrust. The outcome was far from settled. Many more columns would still drive forward before this fog-bound battle reached its true turning point. As the fighting around Arracourt continued, the pattern that had been forming in the fog began to sharpen. The battle's turning point was not a single dramatic charge or one famous order. It was a steady series of small, sharp American advantages piling up against a chain of German mistakes. Every contact in the mist, every ambush sprung from a hedgerow, added weight to the same side of the scale. American tank and tank destroyer crews learned to treat the fog as an ally rather than only a hazard. They tucked their vehicles into hull-down positions behind low ridges and hedgerows, exposing as little armor as possible while keeping their guns ready. Crews waited for the sound of approaching engines and the faint clatter of tracks, then fired first at silhouettes that filled their sights only for a heartbeat before vanishing again. German tanks, advancing in column and often without careful reconnaissance, kept cresting rises or crossing open stretches with their flanks exposed. Experienced crews from the 4th Armored Division were quick to punish those moments, turning each careless move into another burning wreck. Radio discipline and flexible leadership inside the American force amplified those local successes. Platoon and company commanders shared bearings, rough ranges, and enemy locations quickly over the net, turning what might have been scattered, isolated contacts into a rough but usable picture of where the Panzer thrusts were actually landing. Combat command leaders shifted reserves toward threatened points instead of locking everyone to a rigid, pre-drawn line. They trusted their subordinates to improvise local ambushes that suited the ground in front of them. German formations, by contrast, were hampered by weaker communications, rushed planning, and crews who had not yet meshed into cohesive teams. Tanks that should have arrived shoulder to shoulder instead appeared piecemeal, giving the Americans the chance to defeat them in smaller, more manageable groups. When the weather finally broke enough for aircraft to operate, another factor joined the fight over Lorraine. Fighter bombers swept in over columns that were already disorganized and depleted by days of close-range ground combat. They struck tanks caught on roads and soft-skinned vehicles bunching up near villages and crossroads. Drivers who had been nervously watching the hedgerows and ridgelines now had to scan the sky as well. The air attacks did not win the battle on their own, but they deepened the damage done by the ambushes and short-range duels on the ground. Pressure came from above and ahead at the same time. For German crews, the psychological weight of that combination was heavy. Many had already watched comrades knocked out at short range by enemies they barely glimpsed in the fog. Now, thunderous strikes from the air added to the wreckage and confusion. Messages from forward units sounded more strained, and the sense of driving a powerful, fresh formation into Lorraine started to erode. Under that growing pressure, German momentum bled away. By the time the main thrusts had spent themselves, the brigades that had rolled toward Arracourt as robust Panzer formations had lost a large share of their tanks and much of their offensive spirit. The Americans, battered but cohesive, still held the key ground around the villages and ridges of Arracourt. In the immediate aftermath, the fields and villages around the battle zone showed just how hard the fight had been. Burned-out German tanks and assault guns littered the approaches, many knocked out at short range, or halted in awkward positions that hinted at sudden contact and rapid, confused maneuvers in the fog. American losses were real and painful as well, with Shermans and tank destroyers left wrecked in orchards and along hedgerows. Even so, the balance of damage was unmistakable when officers walked the ground and counted the hulks. The 4th Armored Division and its supporting units had held. They had blunted and then broken one of the last substantial German armored counterattacks in the West that autumn. The flank of Patton's Third Army remained intact, and the drive toward the Moselle River and the German border could continue. At the broader campaign level, the failure around Arracourt meant that German hopes of throwing the Americans back from Lorraine faded into the same mist that had hidden their early movements. The Panzer brigades committed here emerged as shadows of their intended strength, their tanks destroyed or abandoned, and their crews shaken by the experience of attacking into an enemy who often saw them first and struck from unexpected angles. Those losses could not be easily replaced. Every destroyed tank at Arracourt was one less vehicle available for later defensive battles on the frontier. It was also one less hull that might have been used in the desperate winter offensives German planners still hoped to launch. For students of armored warfare, the Foggy Tank Battle at Arracourt has become a case study in how training, communication, and the use of terrain can outweigh apparent disadvantages in armor thickness or gunpowder. American crews in their Shermans did not somehow transform their vehicles into heavier tanks. Instead, they learned to fight them intelligently, using the folds of Lorraine's countryside, the concealment offered by the fog, and disciplined radio work to create local superiority at the moment of contact. When they struck, they tried to do so from positions of choice rather than chance. That mindset turned a fragile-looking armored screen into a much harder target than German planners expected. On the German side, the battle stands as a warning about relying too heavily on impressive machines without giving equal attention to reconnaissance and coordination. The tanks they fielded around Arracourt were formidable on paper, with thick armor and powerful guns. Sent forward with thin reconnaissance, rushed planning, and shaky communications, those assets became vulnerable rather than decisive. Instead of a clean breakthrough, the result was a grinding series of encounters that wore down the attacking force. Arracourt shows how attacking blind into an enemy who knows the ground can turn offensive strength into a slow, costly attrition. Today, when visitors walk past Shermans and German tanks in museums or study late-war armored clashes on staff rides and in classroom discussions, the story of Arracourt helps anchor those steel silhouettes in a real human contest. It highlights the value of crews who know their ground and trust their communications, and it underlines the danger of driving powerful formations into battle without a clear picture of what waits ahead. It also shows how a chain of small tactical decisions taken by tank commanders, gunners, and company leaders over several days can add up to the collapse of a much larger operational plan. The Foggy Tank Battle at Arracourt is more than a narrow footnote in the history of the Second World War. It is a reminder that information, initiative, and teamwork can shatter even a strong panzer force. Headline Wednesday is developed by Trackpads.com as part of Dispatch, U.S. Military History Magazine.